Fast Asleep with Gina Marie. Hi everyone, I'm still Gina, and Marie's feeding the cat. Thanks for joining me. Well, if you're ready, we have another great classic short story, and today it's from one of America's most talented authors. Please, I need you to keep something in mind. Occasionally we hear otherwise. If you are here strictly for an autonomous sensory meridian response, you may know that as ASMR, you're not going to find it here. We don't have any boring triggers for that. Our triggers are full-bodied stories that are purposefully chosen for you. They're here to engage and transport us away from our concerns. It's as simple as that. And if that works for you, wonderful. Don't forget to comment, like, and subscribe. Thank you. Well, today's author was born in New Orleans, spent his childhood in both the Deep South and New York City. Before his stepfather adopted him, his name was Truman Person. That's right, we all know him now as Truman Capote, the novelist, playwright, screenwriter, actor, and fortunately, short story writer. He wrote his very first work of fiction at the age of 11. He spoke of his early writing as just his way of coping with the crazy upbringing that he had. It was filled with parental divorce and abandonment. He believed there was only one relative in his life who loved him, and that was Nanny Rumbly Falk. He wrote about her lovingly in his beautiful autobiographical story, A Christmas Memory. It's on Fast Asleep, episode 177. Now, if you've had the pleasure of watching Truman Capote in old interviews, I'm sure you'll never forget this strange little man with a very funny little voice. He was strange, but he was also very charming. He was a master of words, and not just in his written work. Okay, yes, author of The Light-Hearted Breakfast at Tiffany's, but don't forget, he also wrote the chilling true crime novel In Cold Blood. Yes, but only after charming his way into the real-life characters that he very deeply investigated. Well, it was a bestseller, In Cold Blood, and it gave Capote the success and wealth he had always craved. It made him the toast of the jet set. This wealth and fame was wonderful, but unfortunately, it was what led to his slow but steady decline because of alcoholism and drug addiction. He died in 1984 in Los Angeles of liver disease. He was 59 years old. More than 20 of his works were adapted into films or television, and like many of his tales, ours today is somewhat autobiographical. It was one of his earlier works, and its protagonist is very self-absorbed and terribly hurtful for many reasons. And here's our warning. His treatment of a disabled person is absolutely despicable. We bring you all this, and yet we have to say, as Norman Mailer once said, he wrote the best sentences. He's right. Just listen. Tuck in, everybody. Published in 1947, here's Truman Capote's Shut a Final Door. Part 1. Walter, listen to me. If everyone dislikes you, works against you, don't believe they do so arbitrarily. You create these situations for yourself. Anna had said that. And though his healthier side told him she intended nothing malicious, if Anna was not a friend, then who was? He despised her for it, had gone around telling everybody how much he despised Anna. What a bitch she was, that woman, he said. Don't trust that Anna. This plain-spoken act of hers. Nothing but a cover-up for all her repressed hostility. Terrible liar, too. Can't believe a word she says. Dangerous. My God! And naturally, all he said went back to Anna, so that when he called about a play opening they'd planned attending together, she told him, "Sorry, Walter, I can't afford you any longer. I understand you very well, and I have a certain amount of sympathy. It's very compulsive, your malice, and you aren't too much to blame, but I don't want ever to see you again, because I'm not so well myself that I can afford it." But why? And what had he done? Well, sure, he'd gossiped about her, but it wasn't as though he'd meant it. And after all, as he said to Jimmy Bergman, now there was a two-face if ever there was one, what was the use of having friends if you couldn't discuss them objectively? He said, you said, they said, we said, round and round, round and round, like the paddle-bladed ceiling fan wheeling above, turning and turning, stirring stale air ineffectively. It made a watch-tick sound, counted seconds in the silence. Walter inched to a cooler part of the bed and closed his eyes against the dark little room. At 7 that evening, he'd arrived in New Orleans. At 7:30, he'd registered in this hotel, an anonymous side street place. It was August, and it was as though bonfires burned in the red night sky, and the unnatural southern landscape, observed so assiduously from the train, in which, trying to sublimate all else, he retraced in memory, intensified a feeling of having traveled to the end, the falling off. But why? He was here, in this stifling hotel, in this faraway town. He could not say. There was a window in the room, but he could not seem to get it open. He was afraid to call the bellboy. What queer eyes that kid had. And he was afraid to leave the hotel, for what if he got lost? And if he got lost even a little, then he would be lost altogether. He was hungry. He hadn't eaten since breakfast. So he found some peanut butter crackers left over from a package he'd bought in Saratoga, and washed them down with a finger of 4 roses. The last. It made him sick. he vomited in a wastebasket, collapsed back on the bed, and cried until the pillow was wet. After a while, he just lay there in the hot room, shivering, just lay there and watched the slow turning fan. There was no beginning to its action and no end. It was a circle. And I, the earth, the rings of a tree, everything is a circle. And all circles, Walter said, have a center. It was crazy for Anna to say what had happened was his own doing. If there was anything wrong with him, really, then it had been made so by circumstances beyond his control, by, say, his churchly mother, or his father, an insurance official in Hartford, or his older sister Cecile, who'd married a man 40 years her senior. "I just wanted to get out of the house." That was her excuse. And to tell the truth, Walter had thought it reasonable enough. But he did not know where to begin thinking about himself, did not know where to find the center. The first telephone call? No, that had been only 3 days ago, and properly speaking, was the end, not the beginning. Well, he could start with Irving, for Irving was the first person he'd known in New York. Now, Irving was a sweet little boy with a remarkable talent for chess, and not much else. He had silky hair and pink baby cheeks and looked about 16. Actually, he was 23, Walter's age, and they'd met at a bar in the village. Walter was alone and very lonesome in New York, and so when this sweet little Irving was friendly, he decided, maybe it was a good idea to be friendly too, because you never can tell. Irving knew a great many people, and everyone was very fond of him, and he introduced Walter to all his friends. And there was Margaret. Margaret was more or less Irving's girlfriend. She was only so-so looking. Her eyes bulged. There was always a little lipstick on her teeth. She dressed like a child of 10. But she had a hectic brightness which Walter found attractive. He could not understand why she bothered with Irving at all. "Why do you?" he said, on one of the long walks they'd begun taking together in Central Park. "Irving is sweet," she said, "and he loves me very purely. And who knows, I might just as well marry him." "Oh, a damn fool thing to do," he said. "Irving could never be your husband because he's really your little brother. Irving is everyone's little brother." Margaret was too bright not to see the truth in this. So, one day, when Walter asked if he might not make love to her, she said, all right. She didn't mind if he did. They made love often after that. Eventually, Irving heard about it, and, One Monday, there was a nasty scene in, curiously enough, the same bar where they'd met. There had been that evening a party in honor of Kurt Kuhnhart, Kuhnhart Advertising, Margaret's boss, and she and Walter had gone together, afterwards stopping by this bar for a nightcap. Except for Irving and a couple of girls in slacks, the place was empty. Irving was sitting at the bar, his cheeks quite pink, his eyes rather glazed. He looked like a little boy playing grown-up, for his legs were too short to reach the stool's footrest. They dangled doll-like. The instant Margaret recognized him, she turned round and tried to walk out, but Walter wouldn't let her. And anyway, Irving had seen them. Never taking his eyes from them, he put down his whiskey, slowly climbed off the stool, and with a kind of sad, air-sat toughness, strutted forward. "Irving, dear," said Margaret, and stopped, for he'd given her a terrible look. His chin was trembling. "You go away," he said, and it was as though he were denouncing some childhood tormentor. "I hate you." And then, almost in slow motion, he swung out and, as if he clutched a knife, struck Walter's chest. It was not much of a blow, and when Walter did nothing but smile, Irving slumped against a jukebox, screaming, "Fight me, you damn coward! Come on! And I'll kill you! I swear before God I will!" So that was how they left him. Walking home, Margaret began to cry in a soft, tired way. "Oh, he'll never be sweet again," she said, and Walter said, "I don't know what you mean." "Oh, yes, you do," she told him, her voice a whisper. "Yes, you do. The two of us, we've taught him how to hate. Somehow I don't think he ever knew before." Walter had been in New York now 4 months. His original capital of $500 had fallen to 15, and Margaret lent him money to pay his January rent at the Brevoort. Why, she wanted to know. Didn't he move someplace cheaper? Well, he told her, it was better to have a good address. And what about a job? When was he going to start working, or was he? "Sure," he said, "sure." As a matter of fact, he thought about it a good deal. But he didn't intend fooling around with just any little jerkwater thing that came along. He wanted something good, something with a future, something in, say, advertising. "All right," said Margaret. Maybe she could help him. At any rate, she'd speak with her boss, Mr. Kuhnhart. Part 2. The KKA, so-called, was a middle-sized agency, but as such things go, very good, the best. Kurt Kuhnhart who founded it in 1925, was a curious man with a curious reputation. A lean, fastidious German, a bachelor. He lived in an elegant black house on Sutton Place, a house interestingly furnished with, among other things, 3 Picassos, a superb music box, South Sea Island masks, and a burly Danish youngster, the houseboy. He invited occasionally someone of his staff in to dinner, whoever was favorite at the moment, for he was continually selecting protégés. It was a dangerous position, these alliances being, as they were, whimsical and uncertain. The protégé found himself checking the want ads when, just the evening previous, he dined most enjoyably with his benefactor. During his second week at the KKA, Walter, who had been hired as Margaret's assistant, received a memorandum from Mr. Coonhart asking him to lunch. And this, of course, excited him unspeakably. "Killjoy," said Margaret, straightening his tie, plucking lint off a lapel. "Oh, nothing of the sort. It's just that, well, Coonhart's wonderful to work for so long as you don't get too involved, or you're likely not to be working, period." Oh, Walter knew what she was up to. She didn't fool him a minute. He felt like telling her so, too, but restrained himself. It wasn't time yet. One of these days, though, he was going to have to get rid of her, and soon. It was degrading, his working for Margaret. And besides, the tendency from now on would be to keep him down. But nobody could do that, he thought, looking into Mr. Coonhart's sea-blue eyes. Nobody could keep Walter down. "You're an idiot," Margaret told him. "My God, I've seen these little friendships of KK's 12 times, and they don't mean a damn. He used to palsy-walsy around with the switchboard operator. All KK wants is someone to play the fool. Take my word, Walter, there aren't any shortcuts. What matters is how you do your job." He said, "And have you complaints on that score? I'm doing as well as could be expected." "Well, it depends on what you mean by expected," she said. One Saturday, not long afterwards, he made a date to meet her in Grand Central. They were going up to Hartford to spend the afternoon with his family, and for this she'd bought a new dress, new hat, and shoes. But he did not show up. Instead, he drove out on Long Island with Mr. Coonhart and was the most odd of 300 guests at Rosa Cooper's debut ball. Rosa Cooper, née Cupperman, was heiress to the Cooper dairy products, a dark, plump, pleasant child with an unnatural British accent, the result of 4 years at Miss Jewett's. She wrote a letter to a friend named Anna Stimpson, who subsequently showed it to Walter. Met the divinest man. Danced with him 6 times. A divine dancer. He is an advertising executive and is terribly, divinely good-looking. We have a date, dinner, and the theater. Margaret did not mention the episode, nor did Walter. It was as though nothing had happened, except that now, unless there was office business to discuss, they never spoke, never saw each other. One afternoon, knowing she would not be at home, he went to her apartment and used a pass key given him long ago. There were things he'd left there. Clothes, some books, his pipe. Rummaging around, collecting all this, he discovered a photograph of himself, scrawled red with lipstick. It gave him, for an instant, the sensation of falling in a dream. He also came across the only gift he'd ever made her, a bottle of L'air Bleu, still unopened. He sat down on the bed and, smoking a cigarette, stroked his hand over the cool pillow, remembering the way her head had lain there. Remembering, too, how they used to lie here Sunday mornings reading the funnies aloud, Barney Google and Dick Tracy and Joe Palooka. He looked at the radio, the little green box. They'd always made love to music, any kind, jazz, symphonies, choir programs. It had been their signal, for whenever she'd wanted him, she'd said, "Shall we listen to the radio, darling?" Anyway, it was finished, and he hated her, and that was what he needed to remember. He found the bottle of perfume again and put it in his pocket. Rosa might like a surprise. In the office the next day, he stopped by the water cooler, and Margaret was standing there. She smiled at him fixedly and said, "Well, I didn't know you were a thief." It was the first overt disclosure of the hostility between them. And suddenly it occurred to Walter he hadn't, in all the office, a single ally. Kuhnhardt. He could never count on him. And everyone else was an enemy. Jackson, Einstein, Fisher, Porter, Capehart, Ritter, Villa, Bird. Oh, sure, they were all smart enough not to tell him point blank. Not so long as KK's enthusiasm continued. Well, dislike was, at least, positive, and the one thing he could not tolerate was vague relations. Possibly because his own feelings were so indecisive, ambiguous. He was never certain whether he liked X or not. He needed X's love, but was incapable of loving. He could never be sincere with X, never tell him more than 50% of the truth. On the other hand, it was impossible for him to permit X these same imperfections. Somewhere along the line, Walter was sure he'd be betrayed. He was afraid of X, terrified. Once, in high school, he'd plagiarized a poem and printed it in the school magazine. Oh, he could not forget its final line. "All our acts are acts of fear." And when his teacher caught him out, had anything ever seemed to him more unjust? Part 3. He spent most of the early summer weekends at Rosa Cooper's Long Island place. The house was, as a rule, well staffed with hearty Yale and Princeton undergraduates, which was irritating, for they were the sort of boys who, around Hartford, made green birds fly in his stomach, and seldom allowed him to meet them on their own ground. As for Rosa herself, she was a darling. Everyone said so, even Walter. But darlings are rarely serious, and Rosa was not serious about Walter. He didn't mind too much. He was able on these weekends to make a good many contacts. Taylor Ovington, Joyce Randolph, the starlet, E.L. McAvoy, a dozen or so people whose names cast considerable glare in his address book. One evening, he went with Anna Stimpson to see a film featuring the Randolph girl. And before they were scarcely seated, everyone for aisles around knew she was a friend of his, knew she drank too much, was immoral, and not nearly so pretty as Hollywood made her out to be. Anna told him he was an adolescent female. "Oh, you're a man in only one respect, sweetie," she said. It was through Rosa that he'd met Anna Stimpson, an editor on a fashion magazine. She was almost 6 feet tall, wore black suits, affected a monocle, a walking cane, and pounds of jingling Mexican silver. She'd been married twice, once to Buck Strong, the horse opera idol, and she had a child, a 14-year-old son who'd had to be put away in what she called a corrective academy. "Oh, he was a nasty child," she said. "He liked to take pot shots out the window with a .22 and throw things and steal from Woolworths. Awful brat, just like you." Anna was good to him, though, and in her less depressed, less malevolent moments, listened kindly while he groaned out his problems, while he explained why he was the way he was. All his life, some cheat had been dealing him the wrong cards. Attributing to Anna every vice but stupidity, he liked to use her as a kind of confessor. There was nothing he could tell her of which she might legitimately disapprove. He would say, "I've told Kuhnhart a lot of lies about Margaret. I suppose that's pretty rotten, but she would do the same for me. And anyway, my idea is not for him to fire her, but maybe transfer her to the Chicago office. Or I was in a bookshop and a man was standing there and we began talking. A middle-aged man, rather nice, very intelligent. When I went outside, he followed a little ways behind. I crossed the street. He crossed the street. I walked fast. He walked fast. This kept up 6 or 7 blocks. And when I finally figured out what was going on, I felt tickled. I felt like kidding him on. So I stopped at the corner and hailed a cab. Then I turned around and gave this guy a long look. And he came rushing up, all smiles, and I jumped in the cab and slammed the door and leaned out the window and laughed out loud. The look on his face, it was awful. It was like Christ. I can't forget it. And tell me, Anna, why did I do this crazy thing? It was like paying back all the people who've ever hurt me. But it was something else, too. He would tell Anna these stories, go home, and go to sleep. His dreams were clear blue. Now, the problem of love concerned him, mainly because he did not consider it a problem. Nevertheless, he was conscious of being unloved. This knowledge was like an extra heart beating inside him. But there was no one. Anna, perhaps? Did Anna love him? Oh, said Anna. When was anything ever what it seemed to be? Now it's a tadpole. Now it's a frog. It looks like gold, but you put it on your finger and it leaves a green ring. Take my second husband. He looked like a nice guy and turned out to be just another heel. Look around this very room. Why, you couldn't burn incense in that fireplace. And those mirrors, they give space? They tell a lie. Nothing, Walter, is ever what it seems to be. Christmas trees are cellophane, and snow is only soap chips. Flying around inside us is something called the soul, and when you die, you're never dead. Yes, and when we're alive, we're never alive. And so, you want to know if I love you. Don't be dumb, Walter. We're not even friends. And so, you want to know if I love you. Don't be dumb, Walter. We're not even friends. Part 4. Listen, the fan, turning wheels of whisper. He said, you said, They said, we said, round and round, fast and slow, while time recalled itself in endless chatter. Old broken fan breaking silence. August the 3rd, the 3rd, the 3rd. August the 3rd, a Friday, and it was there, in Winchell's column, his own name. Big shot, ad exec, Walter Ranney, and dairy heiress, Rosa Cooper, are telling intimates to start buying rice. Walter himself had given the item to a friend of Winchell's. He showed it to the counter boy at the Whalens where he ate breakfast. "That's me," he said. "I'm the guy." And the look on the boy's face was good for the digestion. It was late when he reached the office that morning, and as he walked down the aisle of desks, a small, gratifying flurry among the typists preceded him. No one said anything, however. Around 11, after a pleasant hour of doing nothing but feel exhilarated, he went to the drugstore downstairs for a cup of coffee. 3 men from the office, Jackson, Ritter, and Bird, were there, and when Walter came in, Jackson poked Bird, and Bird poked Ritter, and all of them turned round. "What you say, big shot?" said Jackson, a pink man, prematurely bald, and the other 2 laughed. Acting as if he hadn't heard, Walter stepped quickly into a phone booth. "Bastards," he said, pretending to dial a number. And finally, after waiting a long while for them to leave, he made a real call. "Rosa, hello. Did I wake you up?" "No." "Say, did you see Winchell?" "Yes." Walter laughed. "Oh, now where do you suppose he gets that stuff?" Silence. "What's the matter? You sound kind of funny." "Do I?" "Are you mad or something?" "Just disappointed." "About what?" Silence. And then, "It was a cheap thing to do, Walter. Pretty cheap." "I don't know what you mean." "Goodbye, Walter." On the way out, he paid the cashier for a cup of coffee he'd forgotten to have. There was a barber shop in the building. He said he wanted a shave. No. Make it a haircut. No. A manicure. And suddenly, seeing himself in the mirror, where his face reflected as pale, almost, as the barber's bib, he knew he did not know what he wanted. Rosa had been right. He was cheap. He'd always been willing to confess his faults, for by admitting them, it was as if he made them no longer exist. He went back upstairs, sat at his desk, and felt as though he were bleeding inside, and wished very much to believe in God. A pigeon strutted on the ledge outside his window. For some time he watched the shimmering, sunlit feathers, the wobbly sedateness of its movements. And then, before realizing it, he'd picked up and thrown a glass paperweight. The pigeon climbed calmly upward. The paperweight careened like a giant raindrop. Suppose, he thought, listening for a faraway scream, suppose it hits someone and kills them. But, there was nothing. Only the ticking fingers of typists, a knocking at the door. "Hey, Ronnie. KK wants to see you." "Oh, I'm sorry," Mr. Cunard, doodling with a gold pen. "And I'll write a letter for you, Walter, any time." Now, in the elevator, the enemy, all submerging with him, crushed Walter between them. Margaret was there, wearing a blue hair ribbon. She looked at him, and her face was different from other faces, not vacant as theirs were, and sterile. Here still was compassion. But as she looked at him, she looked through him, too. This is my dream. He must not allow himself to believe otherwise. And yet under his own arm he carried the dream's contradiction, a manila envelope stuffed with all the personals saved from his desk. When the elevator emptied into the lobby, he knew he must speak with Margaret. Ask her to forgive him, beg her protection. But she was slipping swiftly toward an exit, losing herself among the enemy. "I love you," he said, running after her. "I love you," he said, saying nothing. "Margaret, Margaret!" She turned around. The blue hair ribbon matched her eyes, and her eyes, gazing up at him, softened, became rather friendly or pitying. "Please," he said, "I thought we could have a drink together over at Benny's, maybe. We used to like Benny's, you remember?" She shook her head. "I've got a date, and I'm late already." "Oh, yes, well, I'm late," she said, and began to run. He stood watching as she raced down the street, her ribbon streaming, shining in the darkening summer light. And then she was gone. His apartment, a one-room walk-up near Gramercy Park, needed an airing, a cleaning, but Walter, after pouring a drink, said, "To hell with it," and stretched out on the couch. What was the use? No matter what you did or how hard you tried, it all came finally to zero. Every day, everywhere, everyone was being cheated. And who was there to blame? That was strange, though. Lying here, sipping whiskey in the dusk, graying room, he felt calmer than he had for God knows how long. It was like the time he failed algebra and felt so relieved, so free. Failure was definite, a certainty, and there's always peace in certainties. And now he would leave New York, take a vacation trip. He had a few $100s, enough to last until fall. And wondering where he should go, he all at once saw, as if a film had commenced, running in his head, silk caps cherry-colored and lemon, and, well, little wise-faced men wearing exquisite polka-dot shirts. Closing his eyes, he was suddenly 5 years old. Oh, it was delicious remembering the cheers, the hot dogs, his father's big pair of binoculars. Saratoga. Shadows masked his face in the sinking light. He turned on a lamp, fixed another drink, put a Roomba record on the phonograph, and began to dance. The soles of his shoes whispering on the carpet. He'd often thought that with a little training, he could have been a professional. Just as the music ended, the telephone rang. He simply stood there, afraid somehow to answer, and the lamplight, the furniture, everything in the room went quite dead. When at last he thought it had stopped, it commenced again, louder it seemed, and more insistent. He tripped over a footstool, picked up the receiver, dropped and recovered it, said, "Yes." Long distance. A call from some town in Pennsylvania, the name of which he didn't catch. Following a series of spasmodic rattlings, a voice, dry and sexless, and altogether unlike any he'd ever heard before, came through. "Hello, Walter." Who is this?" No answer from the other end, only a sound of strong, orderly breathing. The connection was so good. It seemed as though whoever it was standing beside him with lips pressed against his ear. I don't like jokes. Who is this?" "Oh, you know me, Walter. You've known me a long time." A click, and nothing. Part 5. It was night and raining when the train reached Saratoga. He'd slept most of the trip, sweating in the hot dampness of the car, and dreamed of an old castle where only old turkeys lived, and dreamed a dream involving his father, Kurt Kuhnhart, someone no-faced, Margaret and Rosa, Anna Stimpson, and a queer fat lady with diamond eyes. He was standing on a long, deserted street. Except for an approaching procession of slow, black, funeral-like cars, there was no sign of life. Still he knew, eyes unseen observed his nakedness from every window, and he hailed frantically the first of the limousines. It stopped, and a man, his father, invitingly held open the door.
"Daddy!"
he yelled, running forward, and the door slammed shut, mashing off his fingers. And his father, with a great belly laugh, leaned out the window to toss an enormous wreath of roses. In the second car was Margaret. In the third, the lady with the diamond eyes. Wasn't this Miss Casey, his old algebra teacher? In the fourth, Mr. Coonhart and a new protege, the no-faced creature. Each door opened, each closed. All laughed. All threw roses. The procession rolled smoothly away down the silent street. And with a terrible scream, Walter fell among the mountain of roses. Thorns tore wounds, and a sudden rain, a gray cloudburst, shattered the blooms and washed pale blood bleeding over the leaves. By the fixed stare of a woman sitting opposite, he realized at once he'd yelled aloud in his sleep. He smiled at her sheepishly, and she looked away with, he imagined, some embarrassment. She was a cripple. On her left foot, she wore a giant shoe. Later, in the Saratoga station, he helped her with luggage, and they shared a taxi. There was no conversation. Each sat in his corner, looking at the rain, the blurred lights. In New York, a few hours before, he'd withdrawn from the bank all his savings, locked the door of his apartment, and left no messages. Furthermore, there was in this town not a soul who knew him. It was a good feeling. The hotel was filled. Not to mention the racing crowd, there was, the desk clerk told him, a medical convention. No, sorry. He didn't know of a room anywhere. Maybe tomorrow. So Walter found the bar. As long as he was going to stay up all night, he might as well do it drunk. The bar, very large, very hot and noisy, was brilliant with summer season grotesques, sagging silver fox ladies and little stunted jockeys and pale, loud-voiced men wearing cheap, fantastic checks. After a couple of drinks, though, the noise seemed far away. Then, glancing around, he saw the cripple. She was alone at a table where she sat primly sipping creme de menthe. They exchanged a smile. Rising, Walter went to join her.
It's not like we were strangers,"
she said, as he sat down.
"Here for the races, I suppose?"
"No," he said, "just a rest. And you?" She pursed her lips.
"Well, maybe you noticed. I've got a club foot." "Oh, sure, now, don't look surprised. You noticed. Everybody does. Well, see," she said, twisting the straw in her glass. "See, my doctor's going to give a talk at this convention. Going to talk about me and my foot, on account of I'm pretty special. Gee, I'm scared. I mean, I'm going to have to show off my foot." Walter said he was sorry, and she said, oh, there was nothing to be sorry about. After all, she was getting a little vacation out of it, wasn't she? And I haven't been out of the city in 6 years. It was 6 years ago I spent a week at the Bear Mountain Inn. Her cheeks were red, rather mottled, and her eyes, set too closely together, were lavender-colored, intense. They seemed never to blink. She wore a gold band on her wedding finger. Play acting, to be sure. It would not have fooled anybody. "I'm a domestic," she said, answering a question. "And there's nothing wrong with that. It's honest, and I like it. The people I work for have the cutest kid, Ronnie. I'm better to him than his mother, and he loves me more. He's told me so. Oh, that one, she stays drunk all the time." It was depressing to listen to, but Walter, afraid suddenly to be alone, stayed and drank and talked in the way he'd once talked to Anna Stimson. "Shh," she said at one point, for his voice had risen too high, and a good many people were staring. Walter said, "The hell with them." He didn't care. It was as if his brain were made of glass, and all the whiskey he'd drunk had turned into a hammer. He could feel the shattered pieces rattling in his head, distorting focus, falsifying shape. The cripple, for instance, seemed not one person, but several. Irving, his mother, a man named Bonaparte, Margaret, all those, and others. More and more he came to understand experience is a circle of which no moment can be isolated, forgotten. Part 6. The bar was closing. They went Dutch on the check, and while waiting for change, neither spoke. Watching him with her unblinking lavender eyes, she seemed quite controlled, but there was going on inside, he could tell, some subtle agitation. When the waiter returned, they divided the change, and she said, "If you want to, you can come to my room." A rash-like blush covered her face. "I mean, you said you didn't have any place to sleep." Walter reached out and took her hand. The smile she gave him was touchingly shy. Reeking with dime store perfume, she came out of the bathroom wearing only a sleazy, flesh-colored kimono and the monstrous black shoe. It was then that he realized he could never go through with it, and he'd never felt so sorry for himself. Not even Anna Stimson would ever have forgiven him this. "Don't look," she said, and there was a trembling in her voice. "I'm funny about anybody seeing my foot." He turned to the window, where pressing elm leaves rustled in the rain, and lightning, too far off for sound, winked whitely. "All right," she said. Walter did not move. "All right," she repeated anxiously. "Shall I put out the light? I mean, maybe You like to get ready in the dark. He came to the edge of the bed and, bending down, kissed her cheek. I think you're so very sweet, but... The telephone interrupted. She looked at him dumbly. Jesus God, she said, and covered the mouthpiece with her hand. It's long distance. I'll bet it's about Ronnie. I'll bet he's sick or... Hello? What? Ranny. Oh, gee, no, you've got the wrong...
Wait,
said Walter, taking the receiver. This is me. This is Walter Ranny. Hello, Walter. The voice, dull and sexless and remote, went straight to the pit of his stomach. The room seemed to seesaw, to buckle. A mustache of sweat sprouted on his upper lip. Who is this? He said so slowly the words did not connect coherently. Oh, you know me, Walter. You've known me a long time. Then silence. Whoever it was had hung up. Gee, said the woman. Now, how do you suppose they knew you were in my room? I mean, oh, say, was it bad news? You look kind of... Walter fell across her, clutching her to him, pressing his wet cheek against hers. Hold me, he said, discovering he could still cry. Hold me, please. Oh, poor little boy, she said, patting his back. My poor little boy. Oh, we're awfully alone in this world, aren't we? And presently he went to sleep in her arms. But he had not slept since, nor could he now, not even listening to the lazy lull of the fan in its turning. He could hear train wheels. Saratoga to New York. New York to New Orleans. And New Orleans he'd chosen for no special reason except that it was a town of strangers and a long way off. 4 spinning fan blades, wheels and voices, round and round. And after all, as he saw it now, there was to this network of malice no ending, none whatever. Walter flushed down wall pipes, steps passed overhead, keys jangled in the hall. A news commentator rumbled somewhere beyond. Next door, a little girl said, Why? Yet, in the room, there was a sense of silence. His feet, shining in the transom light, looked like amputated stone. The gleaming toenails were 10 small mirrors, all reflecting greenly. Sitting up, he rubbed sweat off with a towel. Now more than anything, the heat frightened him, for it made him know tangibly his own helplessness. He threw the towel across the room, where, landing on a lampshade, it swung back and forth. And at this moment, the telephone rang and rang, and
It was ringing so loud, he was sure all the hotel could hear. An army would be pounding at his door, so he pushed his face into the pillow, covering his ears with his hands, and thought, think of nothing things, think of wind. Introduction information for this episode is from Literary Hub: How Truman Capote Was Destroyed by His Own Masterpiece by Ebbs Burrow, and other sources in our show notes. The music from this episode is In the Bleak Midwinter by Gustav Holst, arranged and performed by Sheku Canna Mason and Isata Canna Mason. I Can't See You in My Dreams by Martin Zerny. Remember by Christopher Gallivan. Semblance by Opus Monic. Free Spirits by Dolkins. Childhood Rejection by Martin Zerny. Evening Embrace by Johannes Lindstedt. And finally, Alone Together by Chet Baker. Remember, you can always reach me at fastasleep.GinaMarie44@gmail.com, or you can find me on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok. And please, keep us here for you by commenting, liking, and subscribing. Thank you for listening. Keyword: telephone. Good night.